Hi, I'm Ms. Tyler, and welcome to Context for Kids, Week 2 of New Testament Background Studies. And today we're going to talk about King David and King Solomon. And those of you who tune in every week to see what superhero I'm wearing are very disappointed to see that I'm wearing the exact same one as last week, because it isn't last week, it's 5 minutes ago. I didn't feel like changing. I'm lazy. And it's cold. It's November. Anyway. So here we are. This week we're going to talk about King David and King Solomon. And they're both interesting because they were both very beloved by God, and they both, because they're men, messed up royally. But they're pointing the way to something greater, something we're going to get to in the New Testament when we talk about Messiah Yeshua, or you might know him as Jesus. Either way, everything is pointing towards him if we know where to look. So, the dynasty begins. Dun dun dun. King Saul wasn't working out. And King David, he had a hard road to the throne. He was on the run for many years, and he lived as a bandit in caves, always on the run. And we talked about that in Honor and Shame of the Bible, because Saul messed up badly. He disrespected God. He just wasn't a very trustful, devout, decent, sane man. Well, he was sane until he started getting jealous of David. I assume he was sane before that. He had to be sane before that. God wouldn't have chosen him if he wasn't sane before that. So, anyway, he was king, but then when he betrayed God, God sent the prophet Samuel, who we also talked about last week, to go anoint a very special young man. Now, we know he was under 20 when this happened, because if he was over 20, he would have been with the army. Because once you were 20, you were pretty much required to go and fight for your king and country, especially when the Philistines are breathing down your necks. But before this, Samuel was told to go to the house of a man named Yishai, Jesse, in Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem means house of bread. Now, when we get to Yeshua, Jesus later, what is he called? The bread of life. And he comes from the house of bread, Bethlehem. This is the ancestral home of the line of David. And it's very close to Jerusalem, which David will conquer when he's king. I just took a major rabbit trail, didn't I? All right, so anyway, Samuel gets all of the sons of Jesse into the feast. So, you know, they're going to do they did a sacrifice at the Bamot. That's a high place. Now, I know what you're saying. The Bible forbids high places. The Bible forbade pagan high places, but there were certain times during Israel's history when, depending on where the temple was, and sometimes, you know, the ark and the rest of the temple weren't in the same place, and it made things very complicated, and it's way too complicated to go into now. But for this reason or that, we see that offering God sacrifices at certain community centers was allowed, and Samuel did it. And we know that God didn't seem to have any problems with Samuel. So, for whatever reason, this was allowed, too complicated to go into now. So they were having a sacrifice. Not at Shiloh, or Givon, or Nov, or any of the places that the tabernacle stood. It actually wasn't a tabernacle after Shiloh. We don't have to talk about that anymore. You know what? Dang it, I'm just going to have to edit that part out. All right. Anyway. So they were having a sacrifice in Bethlehem at the house of Jesse, Samuel, and they invited all of Jesse's sons. And Samuel's looking with the eyes of men. He looks at the first thing and says, wow, this guy is like king material. He's good looking, he's commanding, this is the guy. And God says, not so fast. You don't see as I see. I see a man's heart. And so Samuel keeps going through all these really impressive sons, and finally said, do you have anybody else? And Jesse says, well, I got the David. He's just out with the sheep. And they said, bring him in. And as soon as Samuel sees him, God says, That's them. That's the king of Israel. That's my king. That's my king. And so he anoints David. He pours the Shemin Mishka, the anointing oil, on him, and he anoints him king of Israel. But that doesn't mean he's king of Israel, because Saul is still there. Saul is still there, and David is an honorable man, and he will not touch a hair on Saul's head. He knows that Saul is God's to deal with, to remove. But David gets more and more popular in the kingdom, even though he's not trying to really draw attention to himself, but he defeated Goliath. And then in order to pay the dowry for the king's daughter, he kills 200 Philistines. And he's made a commander of the armies, and he's winning all these battles, and the people start giving him more and more honor, and Saul starts feeling threatened. Again, this is all explained in Honor and Shame in the Bible, so I'm not going to explain it here. But Saul became insanely jealous. David is on the run for years and years and years. Okay? Now, when Saul finally dies, King David doesn't even get the throne at that point. See, he's only king of Judah for the first 7 years. Only his own tribe will follow him. It isn't for 7 years that that pretty much the kingdom gets turned over to him through the actions of Joab. I'm sorry, not Joab, Abner. All these generals. It gets so confusing. And then David reigns over the entire combined kingdom, all 12 tribes, for 33 years. Okay? Now, David's reign was pretty good. David's reign was a good time for Israel. They were taking other people's land. They were conquering, and they were subduing the Ammonites, the Moabites, all the ites all over the place. David took the capital city of Jerusalem away from the Jebusites. And he was incredibly blessed in whatever he did, and he had many wives. Some ways he was acting just like a king of the ancient Near East. It got him in trouble. And because he wasn't satisfied with what he had, David made a terrible series of sinful decisions because he coveted the wife of one of his mighty men. And he broke a lot of the 10 Commandments. A lot of them. As a result, he committed murder, he committed adultery, he lied, he obviously coveted. He pretty much, if you can screw up in a really big way, he did over a period of time. And it wasn't until, and God let him just kind of, God just kind of watched him do it for a while, let him get really, really, really far away. He became more and more like a king of the ancient Near East who had absolute control over his subjects. And then God really pulled up his leash and had the prophet Nathan go to him with a story about the rich man and the poor man and little ewe lamb. And that's a good one to read. I really like the way VeggieTales did it with King George and the Ducky. I love VeggieTales. Anyway, all right. So, but David murdered. David committed murder. He murdered someone who was incredibly loyal to him, an incredibly good man. And so God pulled him short, but David didn't do what Saul did. Now when God went to Saul and said, dude, you screwed up. And Saul said, but da-da-da-da-da-da, and he made a bunch of excuses. David did not. David accepted it. David said, yeah, I did that. I have gone so far from my God. And he repented. He repented. And God instituted a very harsh sentence on David and on his family. But David never said God was unjust, because David knew what he'd done. Okay? David didn't complain about his consequences. The consequences was not only did the child that was born out of this horrible, serious, sinful series of decisions, But God said the sword would never depart from David's house. And it didn't. And it was just really a horribly tragic series of events. His children did terrible, unspeakable things to him and to each other. Amnon, Tamar, Absalom, and Adonijah all ended up dead or ruined, dishonored. So 3 of the king's sons ended up dead, and his daughter ended up just destroyed because sin entered his family in such a horrible, heinous way that there was no way that it wasn't going to affect other people. David did what he did in the full view of everyone. His kids knew. When we sin in front of other people, it affects them, just like it affected. So it wasn't like God said, well, I'm going to make your kids do these terrible things. No, God was saying, because of what you do, don't you realize the sword is never going to depart from your house? Very serious. Very serious. Okay, so King David, his heir, is King Solomon. And King Solomon ruled over the greatest kingdom that Israel ever had before or since. More land, more vassals, more wealth, more everything. Now, the intrigues at David's court did end after the death of Adonijah and the coronation of King Solomon. Well, shortly after the coronation of King Solomon anyway. Now, I want to talk to you about the birth of King Solomon. So this is talking about David's wife Bathsheba. So she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. In Hebrew, that's Shalomo, and it's a derivative of the word that means peace. Now, the Lord loved him, and he sent word by the hand of Nathan the prophet, so he called his name Jedediah, because of the Lord. Now that's really interesting. We don't see God naming very many people at birth. As a matter of fact, this is the first time I can think of it might be the first time that it happened. I can't remember if God told them to name Isaac, or if she just named him Isaac because she laughed. Can't remember. But this is a specific time where God is naming somebody. Now, why does God name somebody? Well, there's a reason. There's a reason. A lot of people will say, well, God never said specifically that Solomon would be king. That's not true. This is in 2 Samuel 12, but let's go back to 2 Samuel 7. 2 Samuel 7, verses 13 and 14. So David looks around, and now he's in Jerusalem, and he's taken over the palace of the Jebusite kings, and it's a stone palace, but the ceilings and the walls inside are cedar. That was a sign of great wealth in those days. And actually, I'll put a little thing. Elat Mazar of the Hebrew University has found King David's palace, and I've been studying that lately. It's really fascinating. She wrote a great article called "Have I Found King David's Palace?" But she wrote it quite a few years ago, and now they are pretty sure, yes, this was the Jebusite palace that David took over. Very, very grand old building, and they've dug it up. Very cool. Okay, but David sees that he's living in this wonderful palace, and at the same time, though, the Ark of the Covenant is here, and the rest of the holy things, the menorah and the table of showbread, are in another location due to some really unfortunate circumstances in the time of Eli and because of another really bad thing that David did that we also don't want to go into right now. It's too complicated. Talk about it some other time. But God wasn't properly being honored. Things were out of order. And so David, being an honor and shame kind of guy, says, look, I am honored as king over all 12 tribes. I live in this beautiful mansion, and God's tabernacle is kind of in ruins. And at this point, all the original curtains and everything were gone. As a matter of fact, Shiloh, which you can also look up in archaeological digs because they've dug up the stone temple enclosure that was covered with the curtains in Shiloh. You know, things just hadn't been right. So David wanted to honor God with an appropriate temple. And the wording looks a little bit weird in English, but in Hebrew it's very clear that God is saying, well, I have never chosen any of you. No one has ever asked me before, and I have never asked anyone or told anyone to build me a temple. But here in 2 Samuel 7, he says, I will give you a son, I will establish your dynasty, and he, meaning the son, shall build a house for my name. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. So why did I call this slide the Son of God? Well, if you read 10 Commandments and the Covenants of Promise, you know the answer to that. Whenever you see the word Son of God in the scripture, in the New Testament specifically, it's not talking about, you know, born of a virgin, Son of God. No. That's when you see Son of Man, Son of Adam, Son of, you know, those. When you see Son of God, it means the anointed King of Israel. Because God adopts Solomon. Now, oh, I thought maybe I had it. Darn. Anyway, God does adopt Solomon as his own son, and therefore all of the kings of, I keep wanting to say kings of England because of what I've been watching on TV lately, darn it, all the kings of Israel are called the Son of God because they're adopted by God. He gives them the authority to rule because they are of his family. Now this isn't the same as Yeshua or Jesus. I mean, he was a literal Son of God. But this is the title of the kings of Israel. And Nathaniel, when he sees, when Yeshua says to him, you know, I saw you under the fig tree, and he says, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. It says it right there. There we go. All right, now, Solomon was beloved by God, as his father also had been, but he also made a lot of terrible decisions. And some of them were kind of related to his father's bad decisions. And he also made some very good decisions. We'll talk about the good next week. A theme over and over again throughout the Bible is that God chooses men and gives them great responsibilities, gifts, and experiences. Sometimes they lose sight of what's right. Like Nadab and Abihu, David and Solomon. You know what made David different is that when confronted with how wrong he was, he repented and praised God. And he never blamed God for the troubles over his household. Sometimes when, you know, when we get spanked, like we blame, you know, people doing the spanking instead of what we did wrong. Well, David wasn't like that, and that's why David was a man after God's own heart. Now, Nadab and Abihu, you know, I like to say a great calling doesn't mean anything. As a matter of fact, sometimes it means death, because the higher you're raised up, the easier and further easier it is to fall, and the further you fall. Nadab and Abihu, they had a covenant meal atop Mount Sinai in the very throne room of God, and ended up dead a year later because they'd offer strange fire in the tabernacle. Solomon took pagan wives, and when I say he took pagan wives, I don't mean he took like two. I mean, the boy had hundreds. Okay, and he built palaces for them all. Takes money to build palaces, and towards the end of his life, he was actually building temples for their gods. And so that turned his heart away from God, and he was also financially oppressing the people at the end of his reign. Even with as much money as he had, took a lot of money to do the things that he wanted to do. And there was no war during Solomon's time. He didn't have to finance an army like his father had to. No, he was financially oppressing the people to live in a style to which he liked, and to have his harems and his wives all have their own palaces. Okay. And because he did this, under his son, the kingdom was divided. And it's really tragic, because that led to, I mean, really, Solomon was the birthplace of major idolatry in the nation of Israel. It wasn't the first time it had occurred, but it was state sanctioned at this point. So we'll talk about that in a few weeks. Okay, so putting our trust in men. Why would people write a book with such terrible stories about their greatest heroes? I mean, look, we've got Abraham lied to Pharaoh and Abimelech. So did Isaac. You know, sometimes Jacob tricked his father. David committed adultery and murder. Samuel's sons were horrid, wretched people. Gideon's sons were too. Solomon, goodness sakes. And they're not the last. So these are the people we're supposed to look up to. These are the people, these are the heroes of the Israelites. And there are heroes too, because they are the people of the book, and when we are grafted in, we become the people of the book, the whole book. So that's our heritage too. Well, the book is about God being perfect, not about God's chosen people being perfect. All right? He chooses flawed people because if he didn't, there'd be no one else to choose from. Okay? The failures of the kings and the prophets and the priests, show the need for a perfect and righteous king, a literal son of God. So as we're going through, and if you read what I call extracurricular Jewish writings, you will see that they started looking for a Messiah because they could see him in the scriptures. They could see him in everything in the scriptures. And he would have a lot in common with Moses. Moses messed up too. And he would have things in common with Aaron. And he would have a lot in common with Joseph and David and Solomon. With a lot of different people in scriptures, they would be pictures of the coming Messiah. But sometimes those stories didn't seem to mesh really well together. Now we have more answers, but we're still looking to the future when we see the rest of the fulfillment when Yeshua, or Jesus, returns. Anyway, next week we are either going, I haven't decided yet, we are either going to talk about the Maccabean revolt because Hanukkah's coming up and I want to talk to you about the amazing military victories, or we're going to talk about God's command to build the temple and how God gave the plans to David in writing through the Spirit. And it says it right in the scripture, which is so cool. Anyway, so that's it for this week. Let's see, I love you. And I'm praying for you. I hope that you have a wonderful weekend studying the scriptures together as a family. You take care.